So for now, our fifth speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is currently the IMF's resident representative to the Philippines. Until recently, he was a deputy division chief at the Asia and Pacific Department of the IMF and IMF's mission chief for Myanmar. Prior to that, he was the IMF's resident representative in the Pacific Island countries from 2010 to 2014 and served as the IMF's mission chief for Papua New Guinea and Samoa. Our fifth speaker has also worked on countries in Africa and Central Asia, as well as on IMF policies toward low-income countries. Before joining the IMF in 2001, he taught at the Australian National University and the Macquarie University for 10 years. His research interest includes financial inclusion, international trade, general equilibrium, modeling, and development issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Yongzheng Yang.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like first to thank Manila Times to invite me to this very exciting forum. I say exciting because many of you know that I've been here only for 5 months. So this is a great opportunity for me to learn. And indeed have learned a lot from the previous sessions. So thank you very much again for the opportunity. Now, a lot has been said, and there's a lot of overlap between what I've planned and what has been said. So in order to save time, I'm going to sort of reprioritize my presentation a little bit. I do have a few slides to show the macroeconomic performance of the Philippines. So I'll skip that, make it short, and instead I'll focus on what can we do in this country to build on the strength of a very strong economy, very strong growth momentum, and also very strong reform momentum to see how we can achieve more by attacking the country's potentials. But nevertheless, let me just start. Okay, works. So this is the plan for my presentation. As I said, I'll be brief on the first part and mostly focus on the second part and the third part. And then I'll wrap it up by saying a few words about what are the key messages I would like you to take away from this presentation. Now, if not for anything else, I want to confirm with my colleague, Francis, that our forecasts are on the same page. So it is 6.7 for this year. Of course, we are in the cycle of reviewing our growth forecast. And I don't have the number right now, but I think this number is pretty much in the ballpark. But the point here I have to make, just repeating what has been said, that the Philippines economy has been growing very nicely, and both in the short run, the next couple of years, but also in the longer term. We see the medium-term growth at about 6.8%, which we also think is the potential growth that Dr. Tequila has mentioned, the growth that you can sustain without generating economic overheating. Now, if you put the Philippines growth in the regional context, it is also very impressive. So what I'll do in the next few slides, I'll give you a little bit of an international comparison so that you can appreciate where the Philippines stands in terms of international scene. Now, you can see from this slide, that the Philippines has the highest growth in these 5 countries, among these 5 countries. Now, there is a bit of catch-up, of course. The Philippines' relative per capita income is low compared with most other countries. So when your income is low, you tend to grow faster by borrowing technology and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the point is the good economic policies have made a difference. And I'll say a little bit more about policies when we move along. Now, just show you a bit of inflation performance. For a quite long time, the BSP have been able to manage inflation within its target band, which is between 2 and 4%. And this is, if you look at the longer term, this is quite a strong performance, right? A lot of countries in the early years worried about low inflation instead of high inflation, right? Now the inflation has got into the band, is still within the band, even though we saw last month is reached 4%. The point is that the central bank have been able to manage the inflation within its target band and has anchored inflation so that the people know what to expect in terms of price increase. Now, turning to a little bit of information on fiscal policy. Now, we know the fiscal deficit has been rising, and in our view, this is a good thing. A lot of people worry about fiscal deficit. If only fiscal deficit is a result of spending that is not going to increase the future productivity. In this case, as you see on the right-hand side of the chart, the panel, that capital spending, especially spending on infrastructure, has been rising in this country. And that is good for productivity growth that Dr. Tequila talked about, is good for long-term growth. In terms of the external position, I'll just say very briefly, it has come down from a surplus position in the current account to very close to balance. Even if it goes into small deficit, it's not a big problem because a lot of imports are for capital investment and raw material. As mentioned earlier, this is good for the growth in the long run. In terms of the buffers against shocks that previous speakers talked about, what can Philippines do if there's a shock or the worst shock? Well, the central bank has ample reserves. As you see from this graph, foreign reserves can cover around 8 months of imports. The rule of thumb is 3 months or a bit more. And in this case, Philippines has twice as much of the comfortable buffer. Now, having said so many positive things, I do want to highlight a couple of challenges. Poverty still remains fairly high in the Philippines, as you see on the left. Now, there have been a lot of progress, but if you compare internationally, compare with some of the neighboring countries, poverty level in the Philippines remain quite high. Second, the Philippines still has one of the highest inequality levels in the region. Now, that needs to be reduced in order to have more inclusive growth. So what I'm going to talk in the next few minutes is to focus on the growth potentials and the policies, how to tap that potential to bring down poverty, to improve the income distribution of this country. Now, let me first show you this picture. We talk a lot about structural change in the economy. Here, it becomes pretty clear the growth over the last 17 or so years has been mainly driven by the service sector. Now, you notice that agriculture has been shrinking, manufacturing and other activities pretty much constant as a percentage of the total economy. Now, this has been talked a lot about BPOs, and we see this sector have been growing very strongly, stronger than the overall economy. And this is consistent with the previous slide that I presented. Again, we see remittances has been very strong. It increased the income for consumption, but also as Francis said, strengthen the balance payments position of the Philippines. Now, there have been quite a few comments about the strength of the Philippine economy, the potential. Where I see the most potential in this economy is a young, very rapidly growing labor force. Now, this is not very common these days in the region. Even in emerging economies like Korea, well, maybe Korea is now an advanced country, China, Thailand, the population is aging very rapidly. The labor force starts to slow down in terms of growth, but in some cases, going to expect absolute decline. The Philippines happen to be one of the countries, very few countries that has a young, very strongly growing labor force backed by young population. Now, this is the biggest asset of this country. We can talk about other strengths of the economy. We have, tourist resources. We have a lot of mining opportunities, English-speaking population, and so on and so forth. But to me, this is the fundamental in the long run. Now, because of this very ample labor supply, you can see from this chart, the labor cost in the Philippines has been kept very competitive. You have these charts, the wages increase, you have the productivity growth. The net of these two is what we call unit labor cost. That is the cost of labor when you take into account the wage increase and productivity. You see for the red line that the unit labor cost is been very low, in fact been declining, which means we become more competitive. So that is very good for the long run growth. So how are we going to tap into this potential, make use of the strength of the Philippine economy? So I thought about how to frame this issue. How do we take advantage of the strong macroeconomic fundamentals that I talked earlier on, and many have been mentioned previously? How to build on the strength of the service sector we saw in previous slides? How to reap the potential from a very strong demographic dividend that we see in the Philippines? How do we leverage on the rapid regional integration and the digital economy? These are the things, big things that we need to think about in going forward. Let me now say a few words in broad terms. What do we need to do, right, in order to address the question that I raised? Now, when we think about growth, when you have very strong labor growth, the next thing you think about is investment, the capital that Francis mentioned. Here, in terms of international comparison, although the investment rate has increased over time, especially in recent years, Philippines still has a lower investment rate compared with our strong neighbor countries. And this is one area we need to continue to work on. Next, to show you why the investment in the Philippines is possibly lower than other countries. Well, first of all, there are factors like international trade costs, which is still higher in the Philippines than in most other countries. And this is also on the right-hand side, you see that in terms of trade restrictiveness, this is more on the service side. The left-hand side is more on the merchandise goods side. We still seem to be more restrictive on service trade than most other countries. And perhaps as a result, you see our foreign direct investment here is also relatively low. We made progress, but we're still low compared with the other countries. In terms of perception of policies, the Philippines still rank as one of the countries that has a more restrictive foreign investment regime. We know the government is working on this, but we still got some way to go. Now, this has been said a lot. I'll be brief. In terms of both the infrastructure stock and the quality of the infrastructure, that when you compare internationally, the Philippines is still compared unfavorably with other countries. We still have a lot of work to do in that area. Now, one infrastructure area I'd like to particularly mention is telecom and internet. This is an area that is critical for future. It's critical because we're entering a digital age. Internet is critical backbone infrastructure that will support the digital economy. If you look at this chart, Philippines is doing quite well in terms of the mobile cell phone subscriptions. But when it comes to internet, this country is behind most other countries. If you look at China, you look at Korea, Singapore, of course, Thailand and Vietnam. In terms of the internet usage, they're all ahead of the Philippines. And this comes to the point raised early on, how can we make the BPO move to the next step? How we can increase value added? This is where the good infrastructure would spur investment into AI, into other higher value added areas. Now, let me wrap up this presentation with a few takeaways. In fact, only two broad takeaways I would share with you. I mentioned the very strong macro fundamentals, and this is an asset of this country, one of the most valuable assets of this country. We need to maintain that strong macro fundamentals, and happen to be this year is a very challenging year. We talked about inflation being picking up, and one of the things that the central bank needs to do is keep inflation expectation firmly anchored. The central bank has done a great job, but now, because of the business cycle, because of the international cycle, there's a global economy upswing, right? This is time that the policy need to be adaptable to changes. So the central bank will need to watch very carefully inflation and stand ready to tighten monetary policy if inflation pressure continue to build. Secondly, the macro policy coordination is very important. As I said, we are at a cycle. We could be in a turning point. And here, we need both the monetary and the fiscal policy to coordinate, to avoid up and downs, the so-called procyclicality that could cause overheating of the economy. And the fiscal and monetary authority need to work together to make sure that whole overheating doesn't happen. Early on, some of you talked about the credit growth. Now, we still have very strong credit growth, even though it has moderated somewhat. It's still at 19%, if I remember correctly, by the end of last year. This is a very rapid growth. Although we have relatively low credit to GDP ratio, but the speed of growth also matters. When you have very rapid growth, it tends to cause problems. Now, this is not to say we are having a problem because the banking sector is very strong and so on and so forth. But we do need to be careful and using what we call macroprudential policies to make sure the financial system is stable. The next broad takeaway I would share with you is keep up the good work on infrastructure investment and pursuing structural reforms. At least 4 areas for your consideration. Now, the investment in human and physical capital is essential. I mentioned some of the infrastructure gaps. I mentioned in particular internet and so on and so forth. Now, this is critical for raising growth, for embracing the digital age that I mentioned earlier on. Without this infrastructure, it's very hard to see the third leg, the fourth leg of the economy to come forward. we need to build an environment that many legs would appear to support the economy, not just 2 or 3, right? Tax reform and improvement at tax administration, not just tax rate and changes, but also how to collect better within the current rate. It's going to be critical. It's going to increase the resources for public investment, building infrastructure, but also for social spending, right? Building human capital. Third, promoting competition. Secretary Pania mentioned rice, but I also add areas of foreign investment that I mentioned earlier on. Competition, bringing more investment would help the growth opportunities in this country. Finally, financial sector reforms. There was a question early on, some small business facing difficulties getting credit. And this is a problem everywhere. But I believe that there's more can be done, and BSP has been doing a great job by increasing financial inclusion. In fact, the Philippines is one of the leaders in financial inclusion, but there's more can be done, especially using fintech, which we can elaborate a little bit when we discuss. So that is very important. So to end my presentation, I think this country has come a long way, has built a fundamental, very strong macro fundamentals. But to move to the next tier of growth, to grow 7 to 8%, we need to continue to keep that strong fundamentals, but also accelerate structural reform, so that the impediments to higher growth will be removed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yang. May I invite you to be in the sofa in the middle for the question and answer portion. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for questions for Mr. Yang. And we can indulge a little bit more of your questions, as I did notice that there were a lot earlier who wanted to ask questions. So the floor is now open. Yes, sir. Please.
Sammy De Leon, I'm with SSP Transcriptions. I have a question. I'm monitoring the things going on in the U.S., particularly quantitative tightening, whereby the Federal Reserve is starting to wind down its balance sheet, and it has been trending up the interest rates for the treasuries. Earlier, Dr. Daquila's talk was about resiliency to external shock. Would that be something that the central bank has preparations or contingency plans for in case interest rates rise more faster than was planned by the Fed normalization plan?
Thanks. That's a great question. It just reminded me early discussion about stock market. Over the last few weeks, last few days, we've seen much volatility in the stock market. One of the key reasons was that the U.S. data showed that the inflation pressure started to build. Wage increase have been stronger than many expected. And that prompted a lot of people thinking that the Fed may have to increase its interest rate faster. And that prompted a lot of people shifting their investment from the stock market to other areas. Now, that does have implications for countries like the Philippines, because if the U.S. increases interest rate, the chance is that the money will tend to flow to that country, right? So it could cause capital movement across borders, and when we know that when capital moves, it affects interest rate. So that's something, of course, not only in the Philippines, but in all other countries should watch very carefully. I'm sure the central bank in this country is watching carefully about what's happening there and preparing itself for action when needed.
Follow-up question. Since you're with the IMF, sir, is there any kind of contingency plan to avoid a repeat of contagion because of this difference in the interest rate between the developed economies and the emerging economies, like what happened in '97?
Well, the contingency, you can look at the contingency perhaps in two ways. One is that there should be international coordination. There should be communication channels among the authorities across different countries to communicate, right? When the U.S. raises interest rate, it will communicate why it does so, and so that other countries understand. So that's one way to deal with contingency, because the market doesn't like, surprises. One way to do that is strengthen communication. The second is really that countries have to do to prepare for those shocks. You need to build, of course, very strong buffers. And I'm glad to see that the Philippines has strong buffers, as my presentation and France's presentation show that the Philippines has a very large reserve buffers. It also has very other buffers like very low debt, external debt. And so those things would help. Countries need to prepare themselves, building buffers when times are good. Like our managing director always say, fix your roof when the sun is shining. And although the roof isn't leaking here, but there's something we could do to strengthen the position when there's a shock coming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sir. Please go to the mic.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Ferdinand Marañon, President of PhilExport Region 11, Davao. My question is, you said that, and it is really true that the Philippines is the only country in Asia who has very, very low foreign direct investments, because for the past 4, 5, or 6 years already. So, considering that the Philippines is an English-speaking country, considering that we have good economic fundamentals, considering that we have peace and order, what do you think is really the problem why we could not go forward because of this perception of foreigners that their investment is not going to pay off or whatever?
I think just make sure that you got my message right. I was saying that we have made progress. You saw in the chart I showed, investment has been going up. Even foreign direct investment have been doing well. But remember, the Philippines started from a low base, right? The perception many, many years ago still lingering. We made progress. We've improving our fundamentals, so the investment has come in larger quantities. But we still got a long way to go in comparison with other countries. Well, what are other things more we can do? I mentioned a couple of them, right? There are still issues with restriction on foreign investment, right? You saw one of the charts that showed that the Philippines is perceived to have one of the most restrictive regime when it comes to service sector. It also applies to utilities, infrastructure investment, foreign ownership limitations, and so on and so forth. But I would say more broadly, there is a need to improve infrastructure. Now, without a good infrastructure, it'd be very difficult for business to come to invest. Just take manufacturing, right? One of the relative weaknesses of this country is manufacturing. And why that has not taken off as BPO service? Well, manufacturing happens to be very infrastructure intensive. That is, it does require good infrastructure to move goods around very quickly, especially in the modern age when you have a so-called global value chain. Goods can have to be moved many times before it's finalized. So when you don't have a good transportation system, when internet is not reliable, when the ports are not very speedy, you have issues. But as I said, with improvement in the policy environment, with all the investment that the government and the private have been making in this country, I'm sure the environment of the infrastructure will improve, and over time there will be broader growth of the industries in this country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm May Caraballo from the Manila Times. Earlier you said you urged governments to adjust global economic cycles and be ready to adjust monetary policy. What does it mean for the Philippines? Is it time for the Philippines to adjust policy rates? Thanks.
I mentioned that there's a synchronized, upswing of the global economy. You look across the globe, U.S., India, China, Japan, Europe, economic activity is on the upswing. So the global financial conditions could be tightening. Someone earlier mentioned the Fed rate could be rising. And Philippines happen to be also in this synchronization movement. That the economy has been growing very strongly, credit growth has been very strong, and inflation has been on the uptrend, even though it's still within the target band. In that context, I mentioned it is very important for the monetary authority to keep an eye on that swing and make sure that inflation, be maintained in that target. When inflation out of bounds, then it could weaken the expectation, right? So it's very important for the authorities to remain vigilant and ready to act, as the central bank already said, take timely actions once needed. So that's what I think from the BSP side. From the government side, it is very important to keep the fiscal target that it has communicated so far. That is the 3% of GDP fiscal target. We know that if a government's fiscal deficit is higher, that also inject liquidity, inject demand into the economy. When you have inflation high, if you have a strong fiscal stimulus, that could also cause this upswing that could cause overheating. So I mentioned early on there needs to be a coordination between fiscal and the monetary authorities. This is exactly the case that both need to work together to make sure the economy is not overheating. If inflation pressure continues to build up, then the BSP should be ready to take action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Yang. If there are no more questions, then I'd like to ask the audience again to give another round of applause to Mr. Yang. Mr. Yongzheng Yang, Resident Representative to the Philippines International Monetary Fund.